You're listening to The Murder in My Family, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including Missing Persons, DNA ID, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective,
and Campus Killings.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
The views and opinions expressed by guests on this podcast do not necessarily represent those of the podcast, its host, or sponsors. If you would like to discuss the murder in your family on this podcast, please be sure to visit themurderinmyfamily.com for more information. This episode may contain unsettling material or subject matter. Listener discretion is advised.
Independent podcasts like this one depend on word of mouth to bring in new listeners. So if you find that you enjoy this show, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to your podcasts. And be sure to introduce a friend to the show and invite them to listen. With your help, The Murder in My Family can continue to grow and reach a new audience. To learn more about the show or the cases we discuss, please visit themurderinmyfamily.com. You can also find us on Twitter with the handle @murderinmyfam or on Facebook at facebook.com/TMIMF podcast. If you'd like to support The Murder in My Family and get VIP access to things like ad-free listening, early preview episodes, and bonus content of not only this show, but every other podcast on the AbJack network of indie podcasts, consider subscribing to the show with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts for only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year. You'll unlock a variety of listener benefits and you'll be supporting the show in the process. Your support is greatly appreciated, and thank you to all of our supporters that generously donate to help keep the show growing and improving. One last note, please support any of the sponsors that you hear on The Murder in My Family the way that those sponsors support this show. It's with our sponsor support that the show can go on and continue to provide a platform to share these stories with you in every episode. Thank you. And now, on to our show. Welcome back. Today's going to be a little bit of a different episode as I am joined by Jason, the founder of Suwannee Valley Unsolved nonprofit organization. Now, this organization comes together to promote advocacy as well as awareness for local cases in the Suwannee Valley in Florida. It is an area that is very rural and underserved. There's not a lot of budget for some of these law enforcement departments in this area, and so cold cases often suffer as a result. Jason saw a need in his immediate area and decided that he wanted to step in and start doing something to make a difference to impact the lives of some of the families of the missing and murdered. Now, this conversation got me very excited because, as you probably know, I love all things advocacy and definitely was inspired by Jason's message and the things that he is working on to try to drive change in his local area. So I hope you find it fascinating. We also go into some of the cold cases that he has worked on and some of the cases that he is currently working on. I just want to thank you so much for listening. And without further ado, let's get into the episode. So today I am joined by a very special guest. Jason, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to my listeners.
Yes. So hello, everybody who's listening in. My name is Jason Futch. I am the founder and executive director for Suwannee Valley Unsolved. We're a nonprofit organization that's based out of Lake City, Florida, which is right in the heart of Florida, right where Interstate 10, I-75 meet. And we are an organization that's dedicated to highlighting some of the unsolved homicide and missing persons cases in our region. There was some cases that we've experienced in the region where some of the family members were not getting responses from local investigators. And our organization has actually helped reconnect families with law enforcement, even cases going back decades. And I think this was something that was long needed in our area.
That's awesome. I'm a big fan of local advocacy work. It's something that I'm passionate about within my own state. I'm trying to help bring awareness. So I think that's incredible that you're doing that. What led you to start this organization? How did you get the idea, and what in your background did you hear?
We have to go all the way back to 2010, and that was where the seed was planted, so to speak. And when I was a student at Florida Gateway College, back when I was going, it was Lake City Community College. I was a criminal justice student. I was not doing the academy, but I was actually doing the degree. I was on the degree track for criminology. And eventually I wanted to go somewhere with that degree. And unfortunately, I didn't have an opportunity to finish it. But while I was a student there, I had a teacher who was very knowledgeable about some of the local databases in our state. He would show us the sex offender database, how to use it, how to read it, understanding geometrics in that situation, because you also want to understand that if you're going to be moving into a new neighborhood, you're going to want to know where the nearby sex offenders are, especially if you have children. So he taught us how to work the sex offender registry. And then he showed us the missing persons database that the state of Florida has. Back then, the state of Florida had probably one of the most expansive missing persons databases in the country. And in fact, as we were digging in, we noticed that FDLE also had John Doe cases from all the way in Arizona they were putting in. And why, I'm not sure, but I'm assuming it was probably because there might be family out here that might have recognized them. That being said, it was this database that actually planted that seed, because one day, it was literally right after we got out of that class, I went straight to the student center, the student union building, and I pulled out my laptop and I started looking up the FDLE website. And just out of morbid curiosity, I just wanted to see what all was going on in our area. And so we had like a few runaways that were listed in the database. And then there was this one particular case, and it had no picture. And there was a biography on it that said, this person was left at the BP gas station in June 1994. And there was really nothing there other than his stats, like his height, weight, and whatnot. So I knew the next thing was looking at old newspaper articles. And so I went into our public library. They had the Lake City Reporter collections going back to the 1960s. So I went to that exact date, and I find out that a male torso had been located behind a dumpster at the gas station in 1994, in June 94. Same date and everything. And the story went that there was this woman, she was traveling from Florida to Pennsylvania. And ironically, she was heading to Lake City, Pennsylvania when this happened. So a little bit of a fun fact there. But so she broke down en route to Pennsylvania, and she was towed to this service station, which is in the north end of town on US 441. The locals will know what I'm talking about, right past the interstate. And she was walking her dog, and the dog caught wind of what was behind the dumpster, and the dog led her to that site. She didn't think this was real. She wasn't necessarily sure what she just saw. So she went to the gas station attendant and asked him, did they get rid of a mannequin or something? She was still trying to overcome what she just saw here. He's like, okay, well, let me go take a look and see what you're talking about. He goes behind a dumpster. Before he even gets behind the dumpster, he can already tell something foul's afoot, because he could already see the bloodstains coming from the dumpster, and there was drag marks around that led to the behind the dumpster. He went behind the dumpster. He saw what he saw, and he reported it to the authorities. And that's when everything just broke loose there. They found like an egg crate mattress in the dumpster. They found the knives. They found all kinds of evidence in the dumpster. What ended up happening was literally 2 days later, there was a courtroom standoff. Somebody held the courthouse hostage, and it caused a big old scene. And it just dominated the headlines for the next several weeks. And the torso was basically sidelined to a smaller article, and it never really got the attention that it deserved. So I was like, this is really unfortunate, because this could potentially be a solvable case. Right. Even though you had a dismembered body, there is still plenty of evidence in there that could possibly solve this case. So what I did was I would interview some of the retired investigators. I interviewed people who knew about the case, and I would make notes. And then about a year after I found out about this case, I found out about web sleuths. And so I started a thread on there about this torso case, and it just blew up. In fact, the thread is still up on web sleuths right now. You can still read it. But anyways, about maybe a year or two later, I was talking to this evidence technician that remembered the case very well. And he had talked about locating tire marks that were embedded in this concrete. And they knew that it had just been put there recently because it was still fresh. So they had recorded the tire marks, and they identified the car as potentially a Camaro or Firebird type vehicle. And what I didn't know later on was there had also been a witness that testified that he had also seen a Chevy Camaro, dark colored Chevy Camaro backed up against the dumpster, but he didn't know what he was doing. He thought maybe he was just throwing out trash or something. So fast forward 2016, actually, I ended up, at this point, I was not really doing as much as I was doing on the torso case because I had moved to Portland, Oregon at this point. I got an anonymous message stating that someone identified the torso. And I'm like, okay, who is this? And the person claimed to be a loved one of the victim. And she told me that it was her Uncle Freddie and this and that. I'm like, okay, does the sheriff's office know anything about this? And then she said, no, if they find out that I told you, I could possibly get in trouble.
Really weird.
Yeah, exactly. What I ended up doing was I wanted to make sure that whatever information I was getting was going to be accurate. So I actually personally reached out to the sheriff's office, and I spoke with Captain Katina Dix, who is now the major there. And she told me, I can't confirm anything. I can't tell you much, but all I can say is this is a very active case. And I'm like, okay, I can read between the lines here. Right. After that, I didn't really pay much attention to any of it until about March 2017. It was March 7th, 2017. I had just woken up. I still was living in Portland. And you got to keep in mind, it's a 4-hour time difference from Portland to Florida. So I woke up early in the morning, get my breakfast, sit down on the couch, watching the local news when I get a phone call from a friend of mine who still lives in Lake City saying, you need to go on the local news stations in Jacksonville and see what's going on because I think they just identified your torso. I'm like, what? So I go up there and sure enough, they made an arrest in the torso case, and they officially identified this torso as Fred Paul Laster, who was a 16-year-old teen from Nassau County, and they had arrested the family friend, Ronnie Leon Hyde. And the crazy story about this is that Ronnie Hyde was a family friend who was also a youth pastor. He was also a therapist. He was also a musician. This man was a jack of all trades and probably didn't really stick out like a sore thumb when you're talking about killers.
Wow.
But when they started doing talks about this, the raid on his house, he had 2 houses. He had one in Jacksonville and he had one in Jacksonville Beach where he primarily lived. And they had taken out the tub. They had taken out a lot of stuff. He was a complete compulsive hoarder. They had to literally clear his house out, and they had to go through a lot of stuff just to collect evidence. And the bathtub, there were pictures of the bathtub that was released. In the original evidence list, when they found the torso, there had been some non-slip marks, the floral design marks, that you put on the bottom of the tub so you don't fall and slip in a shower. Sure enough, when they took photographs of this tub, it had the same floral pattern non-skid marks in the foot of the tub. And
oh, wow.
It was insane to watch all this unfold, especially considering not even 10 years before that, I was on a quest to identify this kid. I wanted to talk to the family. And so I started trying to figure out how can I get a hold of somebody from the Laster family? And I'm trying to reach out. And I talked to a cousin, said, I think right now they just want their privacy and this and that. A month later, I got a message from Fred's older brother, Richard, basically saying, hey, I want to talk to you about something. And I was like, okay, sounds good. and we talked. And this is one thing I'll never forget, Eric, was that of all the information that was put out there about this case, the family was the one that acknowledged that I was probably the one that helped them out the most, because I was the one that posted all that information about the torso case on Webslows. And if it hadn't been for his sister, Freddie's twin sister, coming across my information about the Camaro, about the floral pattern tub track, the non-slip stickers, and also the fact that she had also come across the National Centers for Missing and Exploited Children's flyer, and it had a plaid shirt. If she had not connected those dots, they would never have been able to solve Freddie's murder.
Wow. That's awesome. So that kind of started your interest in wanting to help additional families, I guess.
Exactly. So basically what happened was, while I was in Portland, it's a big city. There's a bunch of advocates up there. It's serial killer country, so it dominates the headlines, talking about old serial killers like Bundy and the Green River Killer and the Highway Killers and all that stuff. There's all kinds of killers from the Northwest. And I wanted to take away from that stigma and start talking about other cases that weren't necessarily affected by serial killers or had some kind of notoriety surrounding a serial killer. I started a podcast, a true crime podcast. And we just recorded off of those cheap microphones. And I actually kept doing it until past the pandemic. And so it was just something that I was hoping would help other families if they came across my podcast, or if they needed my help with something, because I was also really good with public records requests and stuff like that. So I kept trying to put the heat on things. And while in the Northwest, I had been helping some people with a Jane Doe case up there. It was the Fly Creek Jane Doe out of Washington State. And then when she was identified, I found out about the Finley Creek Jane Doe. And that was actually where I began citizen advocacy, because I connected with Mel Jetterberg, who co-founded the Finley Creek Task Force with me. We both founded that organization, and we started basically working toward getting this young woman identified. And unfortunately, she is yet to be identified. But what we did was, I had a connection in forensic art, Anthony Redgrave, and he was able to, and he was able to come in and do artwork on her face, because we had gotten photos from the Oregon State Police of her remains. So we were able to do a forensic art piece of Finley, and then it blossomed into a woman who saw this art and said, that's got to be my mother, Patty Otto's case. So she came in on board, and this was about the time I started moving back to Florida because of the pandemic, because I had just lost my job. So I was like, do I be poor somewhere where I don't have family, or do I go and be poor with family, help get myself rebuilt? So I come down to Florida, and while I'm still trying to work on this podcast, I had this interesting idea. Now, instead of doing national podcasts, why don't I focus on my local area? And that's basically where the birth of Suwannee Valley Unsolved began. And then basically from that point on, it just blossomed. So I went online one day, just curious to see just how many cold cases are in the Suwannee River Valley. Columbia County had probably the most accurate information in regards to their cold cases, because the Lake City Police Department, Suwannee County Sheriff's Office, and other agencies throughout the area had not been submitting their cold cases to the state database. I went on Project Cold Cases website, and I went into Suwannee County. I checked, and I noticed there was a John Doe case from 1983 out of Live Oak, where there was a body that had been found in the river by canoeists. So I decided I was going to go to the library and look more into that case and see what happened. So I did, and ultimately find out that there was a white male who was located in the river and floated up above the surface. And he had been there for approximately 3 weeks in the water based on the decomposition rate. And so what ended up happening was they took the body to medical examiner's office, and they determined that this person was actually murdered. He had been shot 9 times with a rifle, 9mm rifle.
Wow.
He had been hogtied. His wrists were tied together with his ankles, and a sandbag had been wrapped around his neck and they threw him in the river, either before or after he was shot and killed. This person went unidentified until about 2012, because once we submitted the information to the sheriff's office, I got a quick call back from Wayne Kelly. He's the sergeant of investigations at the Suwannee County Sheriff's Office. And he told me a little bit of more information, but he had not heard this case before until he got the file. And he said that FDLE had identified the person in 2012, and they identified a person of interest in this case. And I'm like, okay, so what's the information on that? There was a guy named Reginald Ward. He was a black male. Keeping in mind, I just mentioned to you that they found a white male. The medical examiners did not identify his race correctly based on the decomposition rate. And I've actually seen the photographs, and you could definitely tell there's easy misunderstandings there. Apparently, he had been lynched by a family who had been known to be really racist people. This was the result of a simple burglary that had occurred. The John Doe in question had apparently burglarized a home in Dowling Park. Afterwards, he had some of those stolen items, and he took them with him to this bar that was owned by the relatives of the person that lived in this house. And they noticed all these stolen items immediately. Sometime between him walking into this bar and his body being found, they killed him. It was really messed up based on some of the information we got. At that point, the suspect was only identified as a person of interest based on statements made by his son, who was in federal prison trying to get a sweet deal to get out of jail early. At this point, his father had died in 1995. But by the time they were trying to close the case in 2012, he stopped cooperating because he had already gotten out of prison. He was already on work release. He didn't need them anymore. So Wayne dug in a little bit more. He found out that a relative who was related closely to the family was actually wanted for a violation of probation because she failed to go to court on some of this stuff. So what they ended up doing was they acted on the VOP. They found her. They threatened to take her back to jail. They said, hey, look, we know you have information. So if you can help us out, we'll dismiss the VOP and you'll be on your way. And she spilled her guts out to Sergeant Kelly and the person that was with him, and basically told them everything that matched up with the reports, and essentially identified the son's father, the one that was in federal prison, as the person who killed Reginald Ward, who was identified as this John Doe. And honestly, if we had not inquired about that case, they would have never revisited it, and they would have never closed that case. And I ended up getting a phone call later from Reginald's brother, who lives in Titusville. And he said that he had been looking forward to the day that they finally closed his brother's case. And I just remember about a year later, we went out to the Titusville area, and we actually happened to have lunch with him and his wife. And it was just absolutely amazing to experience that. And it was about that time I was like, okay, I don't know if I want to do a podcast anymore. I feel like there's a much greater need for actual advocacy in our area. We don't need a podcast to sensationalize them. I think it's time we actually help the families out. And that's what we started doing, and that's what we've been doing since.
That's awesome. It sounds like there's a specific need there, right? So can you talk a little bit about what makes the Suwannee Valley so unique, and why are there so many cold cases and unsolved cases there in that area?
What makes us unique is that it has a much needed service for our area, because the Suwannee River Valley is not a huge region. It's not big by any means. If you put all of the counties together, we're probably about the size of a mid-sized town in California. It's not really that huge. It may be a little over 100,000 people. But that being said, there are over 70 unsolved homicide missing persons cases. And this is completely accurate based on all the information that I've received from each agency. This is a rural area, and having 70 unsolved homicide cases is not something that you would expect. We have about maybe just a little over 100,000 citizens, and most of it is farming communities and nothing metropolitan about this area whatsoever. So it's rural.
Right.
But one thing that's unique is the fact that we are the crossroads of the state of Florida. And this is heavy drugs, heavy violence coming from the interstate. And so I think part of the crime wave is because of the fact that we're right there in the center. And that being said, it also contributes to some of the cold cases because some of these human remains were located on the side of the interstate. They were, dumped into wooded areas. Some of them where, for instance, in 2008, there was a homicide up in the northern area, like actually close to where the torso was found. And the guy who came off the interstate came into a store and attempted to rob one of the convenience stores, but he actually ended up killing this woman. After she complied with his demands, he shot her twice and then just got back into his car and left and just never came back. And the authorities have never been able to identify this person. But what also makes this area unique is the fact that this area is underfunded in regards to cold case money. None of them have a cold case detective. None of them have a designated cold case investigator, and they do not have a budget designated for cold cases. So it's like, basically, we'll only work on this case if you have strong evidence in that regard. And if it's really solid, maybe we'll look into it. But until we get that solid piece of information, we're just going to put it right back on the shelf. Our mission right now is to make sure that is no more. We want to make sure that these families are represented. We want to make sure that these families have the help that they deserve. And we also want to make sure that the investigators have the tools they need to help solve these cases, especially with the fact that technology and DNA cold cases have tremendously improved, especially with Othram and DNA Labs International coming into the fold. Each agency should be aware of tools that they can use to solve a cold case in this modern age.
Absolutely. I think that's really awesome that you were able to identify this need, this lack of resources that's available, and really start to fill in some of those gaps. I think that's incredible. Something as a family member who has been out there for almost 4, I know how lonely it can be for families and how discouraging it can be when you feel like you really have nowhere to turn. I'm excited to hear about the work that you're doing there. Love the approach that you're taking of getting the involvement of the families there.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think that's awesome. What's your vision for the future as you start to build out this nonprofit and start to help additional families?
So our vision basically is a world where we can see to it that all the families get all the answers that they deserve, the answers that they need, and that they all get justice. So the biggest thing that we're trying to do right now is putting together that victims advocate program and making sure that they have the utmost representation possible. And with all due respect to another organization that's also here in the state of Florida, our victims advocate program is going to actually be working with these families, boots on the ground, and helping them out. And also working with the investigators, because I feel like those are 2 important keys needed in such an investigation, especially in such advocacy work, because the thing is, some of these families had not talked to an investigator in 20, 30 years. So that's something that we want to kind of change, where these families, even if they just get a letter yearly or a phone call yearly saying nothing's really changed, we did go through the file, there's not really much we can do at this time, but we were thinking about you on the anniversary. And if there's anything you need, give us a call. If law enforcement can potentially do that, would be great. But then you do have investigators, and again, with all due respect to some of the investigators I've spoken with, some of them like, I just simply have time to talk to these families. I don't simply have time to do any of that. And so I'm just like, but you do. You have a duty. You have a responsibility to keep these families connected, to keep them in communication, let them know what's going on, even if it means we just quickly looked at the file, there was nothing there. Unfortunately, we can't do nothing right at this point. At least it shows the family that they are thinking about the case, that they're looking at it, and they're hoping for the best at this point. So That was one of the biggest issues that we've had, is that you do have some investigators that don't want to do nothing like this, but then you do have
Right.
investigators that really want to dig in on this. And I'm going to give special props to the Suwannee County Sheriff's Office. And I'm so glad that with the Reginald Ward case, we all connected, because since then it's been a beautiful relationship with the Suwannee County Sheriff's Office. They've helped us with presentations. They've actually done fundraising for us. It's just been tremendous. These individuals do really care about the cold cases there. And it's just, I just have to shout out to Wayne and the crew over there at the sheriff's office, because this agency has done a lot for cold cases in the last couple of years. But that's the thing, is that I just feel like we need to get these agencies on board with cold case education. I also want to look into funding and seeing what we can do to help get these cold case agencies funded for these agencies in the area. Even if it means going to the county commissioner and asking them for money, that would be a big start. But ultimately, I would like to see us go to the state and help lobby the state for cold case money, because they're already starting these cold case programs, but there is nothing in the Suwannee River Valley for cold cases. Like FDLE has not sent a task force in our area to look at cold cases. They've been doing it in Jacksonville, Tallahassee, Orlando, and the big cities. But what about us in farmland? Because we haven't had an opportunity to share with them our platform, the state agencies. But I think once we get done talking with them and sharing with them our vision, I think they would want to start funding cold cases in our area.
That's awesome. And I do believe that as start to speak out more and demand the attention of their legislators, that's definitely what it takes, because unfortunately, at least in my experience, legislators, unless they've been personally affected by something, really aren't going to have the motivation to do anything about it until they hear from the constituents demanding that they do something. So I think it's an important thing to first raise the awareness of the people in the area about the issues, to let them know that there are 70 unsolved cases, and that, not that the sheriff's department or law enforcement doesn't want to focus on more, that they don't have the resources or the funding that they need in order to be effective. And they have to go where the leads are taking them, right? So they've got to prove to their bosses that they're doing their job as well. Closing cases is an important part of that.
Right.
So I think that once the public understands, hey, if we just talked to our representatives or called our legislators at the state level, we could probably get some funding.
Yeah.
I think it's brilliant what you guys are doing in terms of raising the awareness, not just of that, but also just the profile of some of these cases that maybe aren't as well known.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, it would be my goal just to see to it that each agency in our area has at least a part-time cold case investigator, a part-time cold case investigator that looks just at cold cases and be able to review them all, see if there's any evidence, and boom, just having that alone, I think would help, because unfortunately, as your show has dealt with the situation here in Lake City before, with the Coker case and with the Jerry case, there's crime happening every day here. And the last couple of years, there were a lot of shootings. There was a lot of death here because of the shootings, gang related. And they're just too busy, I think, right now to handle cold cases. So to be able to just hire somebody to just work part-time even and focus on cold cases, that would be a big win.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a huge believer in what you focus on improves or changes. And so if you are just ignoring situation, then it's definitely not going to improve.
Exactly.
But focusing on it, even if it's just, like you said, a part-time person to just give that attention to the case, it would make a huge impact. One of the things that I struggle with still to this day is people say, oh, families deserve justice. And I don't disagree with that. I think families of murder victims do deserve justice. I'm constantly challenging myself with the question of what is justice?
Right.
What does it look like? And how does it align with our legal system as it is right now, which has a ton of guardrails, which I'm very in favor of, but the guardrails to protect an innocent person from being convicted, which I think is super important.
Yes.
Don't get me wrong. When I say anything about this, it's not because I'm being critical of that. I think absolutely one innocent person in jail is too many.
Right.
But what happens, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, is what happens in my experience is the families of the victims and the victims themselves often get left out of the conversation and often find themselves without any understanding of what's going on and feeling somewhat blindsided sometimes by the proceedings.
Yeah.
So is justice as a concept, it's like really hard to quantify. And I'm going really deep here
No,
because
this
it's
is
something
great.
that my mind is constantly spinning out on, right?
That's
But
great.
like, how do you balance that? How do you balance supporting families while also having to deal with some of the challenges that come with seeking that justice that day in court?
Yeah. And that's definitely something like in some situations you do have to take it kind of like with a grain of salt, because some families do come in distraught because they are very firm that this person killed their relative. But then when the evidence is clear, when you have certain evidence that's available to law enforcement and they are able to actually use it and then identify it and then actually get their suspect, then there's a sense of relief. I guess I can counter question with you, Eric. In New Mexico, do you guys have Marcy's Law or the Victims' Bill of Rights over there?
We do have Victims' Bill of Rights. It is very much like the whole system in New Mexico is skewed towards the side of the offender or the suspect.
Yes.
And so it becomes very challenging. And so for me, I have to grapple with the idea that there's a very strong chance that my brother's never going to get his day in court. And I have to accept that. I have to fight for it, but I also have to accept the very true reality. Nothing could happen. And so then how do I quantify justice? So for me, my thought on this is if I can't get justice for Jacob, then I can help other people that need justice. And then, maybe Jacob's not getting justice. Maybe the person who killed Jacob is able to continue hurting people, and that's an injustice. But I have to hope that eventually somebody will come forward and do the right thing to get this person locked up so they can't hurt anybody else. And in the meantime, I can feel like I'm contributing to justice in honor of Jacob, even if I don't get that myself.
Yeah, and absolutely. And see, that's the thing too, is that my good friend Ryan Backman over in Jacksonville, he founded Project Cold Case in 2015 as a result of the loss of his father, who was murdered inside of a vacant building in Jacksonville. He was painting walls there. And he turned that anger into advocacy, that grief into advocacy. And since then, his organization has reached nationwide in some different countries. And he's been able to put together a complete database of cold case victims on his website, but he's also sharing their stories too. That's the thing, is that he's also got victims advocates there who are knowledgeable about the judicial system, who are knowledgeable about victims' rights. And that is the beautiful thing about Marcy's Law. And I hate the circumstances surrounding why we even need Marcy's Law, why it's even named Marcy's Law. But that said, it has granted more power to survivors than it does the offender. Although in the Marcy's Law, offenders do have some rights, but it gives power back to the families as they navigate through the judicial system. And that was one thing that really caught my attention as I was studying it. Let's say in the instance that someone is arrested in a cold case, the families get to decide, where does this go? Do they want to definitely pursue first-degree homicide charges? Do they want to pursue something a little less, but enough that they know the offender will be in prison for the rest of his life? And then they also get their say in court as the proceedings end, and they have the victim impact statement. It's amazing how Florida has been able to navigate that with Marcy's Law. But then there was also these controversies surrounding it, like protecting names in a homicide investigation and stuff like that. That's why I encourage every state that does not have a Victims' Bill of Rights or has Marcy's Law in some form, they should have it. But other than that, though, that's the thing, is that with families, like in your situation, I have several families who have basically resigned to the fact that I don't think I'll ever see justice in my loved one's case. And in fact, going back to a statement that Ryan had told me once before, which,
by the way, I love that man. He's amazing.
Oh, yeah.
I just hung out with him last week at Nova. He's so cool. And we talked before because he did put Jacob's case on his website, but we actually got to spend some time and compare notes and talk shop, which is awesome. Very smart, doing some amazing things at Project Cold Case for sure.
Absolutely. And I've been to his office before. We've sat down, we've had lunch together, and he's come to one of my presentations, and we've got a great relationship. And I'm pretty sure he's probably told you this before too. He hates the word closure when it comes to cases like this.
Me too.
Closure is when your loved one can get out of their grave and come back to the dinner table. Yep. And that's closure. But justice can always be served, but no family will ever really get closure. And it's like my mom's situation in her sister's case it's not a cold case. It was solved pretty quickly. But even to this day, she acknowledges she's never gotten closure from that case because of how tragic it was. Because it was her sister and her 2 daughters that were murdered by her sister's son. And she never has gotten over it.
The way I see closure is that's what people who don't have to live with this every day get whenever a case is solved, right? Exactly. This is what the people who are invested in it because they want to be, not because they have to be, get closure when the case is closed. What I always wish for the families that I work with and the people I talk to is for them to get peace.
Exactly, peace. And some of that peace is just knowing that their loved one's case was solved and that the person who did it can't hurt nobody else.
Exactly.
And that's a beautiful thing. And it's like with the Lasters, the aforementioned Laster family, like they were happy that their gut instinct was correct. This guy had something to do with the brother's murder because they knew all along he had something to do with his disappearance. And the evidence that they found in the dumpster confirmed all that. And actually, a couple of years ago, he was sentenced to life in prison with no parole. So now they're like, now we can relax. After the trial was over, they told me if those TV shows call around, just tell them we're not interested because we don't even want to talk about this no more because we got our answers.
Yeah.
No. And the case could be sensationalized, but they're not going to be participating in any of that. But we also make sure that we keep the families in our hearts and our minds always because these families are hurting. So that's 70 families in the Suwannee River Valley that are hurting. And some of them don't even have families anymore. We definitely have to keep fighting for justice for these families because if we don't, then who will? And who's going to actually keep the investigators and all of them accountable? Because one family alone isn't going to do it. It takes all of us to ensure that these families get the help that they've probably been needing for the last 10, 15, 20, even 40 years. And then we just go from there.
Man, I really am inspired by the work that you're doing. I just want you to take a minute to share a little bit with my listeners about how they can find information on SVU, Suwannee Valley Unsolved, and how they can support your efforts, whether it be through donations or other methods that you need support on from the general public.
Yeah, you guys can find us on social media. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, X, I guess it's called now, Twitter. You can find us anywhere online. And there's been news stories written up about us already. Some of that information you can piece together, but you can also email me directly, info@SuwanneeValleyUnsolved.org. Next month, we're getting ready to launch our website, SuwanneeValleyUnsolved.org. It's going to be comprehensive, probably going to have one of the most accurate databases for unsolved homicide and missing persons in our region. So stay tuned for that. That's exciting because everyone will be able to look up these cases and get more information instead of being left in the dark, unfortunately. So that's going to be amazing. So once we launch that, and that's actually going to be launched once we have our fundraising dinner in September, which Aphrodite Jones is going to be headlining.
Awesome.
That's exciting. We can always take donations. So right now you can donate to us on Cash App. Our handle is SVU Treasurer. And then also we have our Better World website, SuwanneeValleyUnsolved.betterworld.org. You can donate there, or if you're interested in joining us for the fundraising dinner or Hope and Justice dinner, you can also purchase tickets through that website as well, which will be held at the historic Florida Sheriff's Youth Ranch. So we're very excited to have that. You can donate through the Better World website or Cash App right now.
Awesome. Well, man, I really admire the work that you're doing. And to my listeners, if you feel like getting involved and putting some of that true crime listenership into action, you can do that by supporting the Suwannee Valley Unsolved nonprofit, as well as sharing any of the cases that are being shared on that social media page as well. Jason, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing all that amazing information. I think you can expect in the future to be hearing some of the families that Jason is working with here on this show so that we can get them some more awareness as well. Any final thoughts as we wrap it up, sir?
Yeah, just for those who are listening, don't be afraid to step up and do something for these families. These families are very important. These families have been needing justice for years. If you live in a rural area and you can combine your statistics easily and see that there is a very big misrepresentation of justice in your area in regards to cold cases, do something about it. Don't just sit there and sit on the sidelines. Do something about it. Get some answers for these families because they deserve it. This is why we do this. It's for the families. This is to support families. Just do something for these families, even if it means starting up an organization like ours in your area. I highly encourage it because it can be very helpful in the future for your organization or your area. So, yeah, basically, this is definitely a big call to all the advocates out there for sure.
There we go. Advocates and even wannabe advocates.
Yep.
All it takes is a little bit of action to go from a wannabe to an actual advocate.
Exactly.
Although there are classes to get certified as well. So you can do that as well. Appreciate chatting with you, Jason. I hope that you stay safe out there with all the crazy Florida weather that's been going on. Thank you once again for joining me for this episode of The Murder in My Family. We'll be back here soon with an all-new episode of The Murder in My Family, and I hope that you'll join me for it. But before you go, remember that every murder victim means something to somebody.